All right. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, Dr. Salvino, I want to thank you for inviting me. It really is an absolute honor to be invited to this forum and to ask to speak on what I think is perhaps the most important issue that surrounds this healthcare debate, and that's the constitutionality. And those of you that have heard me speak before, you will know that I don't spend a lot of time focusing on policy. And that may be by virtue of my background as an instructor and an adjunct professor of constitutional law, but just who I am and what I believe in. I believe that sometimes we as a culture, as a society, we've spent so much time focusing on the policy surrounding the issue as opposed to the real issue, which is, does this survive constitutional muster? Is there constitutional authority to do what Congress has ultimately done? Now, I'm sure you've heard the quote by John Locke. It says, where the law ends, tyranny begins. Now, what does that mean to you? To me, it is very simple. We are a country that is based upon laws. And we expect not only the citizenry to follow those laws, we expect those in authority to follow the laws. And my hope is that by the time I sit down and by the end of this 2 hours, you'll have learned something and that I will give you some ammunition to really go out and discuss this issue. But we should all know that in order for Congress, the President, the U.S. Supreme Court to do anything, they need the authority granted by the language of the U.S. Constitution to do so. For example, if you see the President doing something and you're discussing that with another individual, the first question that should come to your mind is very simple. Where does he get the authority to do A, B, and C? When Congress enacts a law pertaining to immigration or health care or anything else, whatever it is they decide to do, your question should be, first and foremost, where in the Constitution is it outlined that they can do what ultimately they're doing? Right? Article 1 grants the legislative branch of government their power. Article 2, judicial. Article 2, executive. Article 3, judicial. So now the question becomes, where in Article 1, which again is the legislative branches essentially giving them the power that they have to conduct themselves, to enact laws, where in Article 1 does it indicate that they have the power to do what they've ultimately done? Right? It says all legislative powers herein. If you read Article 1, one of the first things you will read is all legislative powers herein, which means what? The powers that they have to act are outlined in Article 1 itself. They are enumerated powers, correct? So where is it that they are now arguing that they have this power? Well, before I talk about that, let's talk about the converse of that. And that is the 10th Amendment, right? 10th Amendment says, those powers not given to the federal government are reserved to whom?
States.
The states, right? So there's a battle going on here, right? There's the federal government taking a position that they have the authority here under Article 1 to do what they've done. And then you have states that are arguing they do not have that power. That power is reserved to us, the states. Now look, this is an interesting phenomenon, what's going on here. If you look over the past 240 years, let's look at the Articles of Confederation for a moment. The Articles of Confederation, why was James Madison so upset by that particular article? Because it gave the states too much power. It simply gave them too much power, and they essentially were acting as independent entities, independent countries. Now look at what's happened 240 years later. We see that the pendulum has swung to the other extreme. That is, now we have a centralized government, a central government, a federal government that has too much power. Now, James Madison didn't approve of the independent states under the Articles, and he certainly wouldn't approve of what is going on now with respect to what the government has done. Because they simply, what have they done? Let's talk about that with the health care bill. What authority are they claiming that they have? Well, there's two primary arguments, and let me discuss one, and maybe later on in the question and answer I'll discuss the other. But the primary argument here is that they have power under the Interstate Commerce Clause. Well, let me tell you something, ladies and gentlemen. If they have power under the Interstate Commerce Clause to enact this health care bill, they have the authority to enact pretty much any law that they want. Think about what the federal government has done over the past 100 years. Let me just give you an example. All the gun laws that exist out there, there's over 20,000 gun laws on the books. Where do they get their authority to enact such a law? I can tell you that the overwhelming majority of those laws are enacted under the Interstate Commerce Clause. Now, let's look at some of the things that the U.S. Supreme Court has done, because this is ultimately what it's going to come down to. This case is potentially going to be brought to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court is going to be looking at precedent. What have we said up to this point in time? And there's two primary cases that at least Congress, and those who are advocating for Congress, are going to outline. And that's Wickard v. Filburn, and that's the Gonzales case. Wickard v. Filburn is a case that went down in the 1940s, and it involved a private individual growing wheat. He was growing it for his own consumption, but the government stepped in and said, we have the power to regulate commerce. His response is, wait a second, I'm doing this for my own consumption. The Supreme Court did not side with Filburn. It said, wait a second, you're engaged in a class of activity, and as a result of that, we can legislate, and we can stop you from doing what you're doing. The Gonzales case is very similar. It involved marijuana out of California. The Supreme Court essentially said the same thing. You are involved in a class of activity that we have the right to legislate because of the Interstate Commerce Clause. Here is the interesting thing involving health care. As you look at every one of these cases involving the Interstate Commerce Clause, what do you see? You see individuals engaging in economic activity, some sort of economic activity that has a substantial effect on commerce. What is it that they're regulating here? They're regulating economic inactivity. They are trying to regulate individuals that choose not to take upon themselves health care. And as a result of them choosing not to take upon themselves health care, they essentially are being regulated by the federal government. This is absolutely unprecedented. Never before in the history of this country has the Supreme Court ruled that the legislature can regulate economic inactivity. That is, I'm doing nothing, I don't want to be involved, and now the federal government steps in. They're regulating economic inactivity. For example, if you want to go out and buy a car, you can go out and buy a car. But let's say you choose not to buy a car. Can the federal government step in and say, you know what, you don't drive a car, but you have to buy car insurance? That strikes you as absurd, doesn't it? There's no different what's going on here. They're saying, hey, you don't drive a car, you don't want health insurance, but we're going to make sure that you buy health insurance or you buy car insurance. For what purpose? Because there's individuals that don't have car insurance. There's individuals that don't have health care insurance. So in summary, what things do we need to look at as you analyze this issue and how it's going to come down? First, what does the Constitution say? I think we've nailed that in a nutshell, what it says. Interstate Commerce Clause, do they have the power? Number two, what has the Supreme Court said? I think even in light of what they've said, there are still very valid arguments to be made. And third, are there 5 justices on the Supreme Court that will side with the various attorneys general out there that have filed suit? And I wish I had more time. There's a lot more to this issue. But the bottom line is this is an important issue. It is an issue that goes much deeper than just health care. It's an issue that goes to how much authority are we willing to give the federal government and how much are they going to assume and take upon themselves. Thank you.